House Elections, Constitutional Amendments, and Intergovernmental Affairs Committee. It's called to order. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Representative Blanton.
I am present in the room.
Representative Cantrell. Representative Fisher. Representative Gooch.
Present in my annex office.
Thank you. Representative Heverin.
Present in the room.
Representative Imes.
Present in the room.
Representative Jenkins. Here. Representative Cook.
Here in the room.
Representative Derek Lewis.
Present in the room.
Representative Miller.
Here in the room.
Representative Moser. Representative Nemes.
Here in the room.
Representative Scott. Representative Weber.
Present in the room.
Representative Wheatley.
Here.
Representative Scott Lewis.
Present in the room.
Representative Bratcher.
Here in the room. Everyone, please put their telephones on mute or silence. When the committee members and the ones at the desk talk, please make sure your green light is on, because people at home are listening, and there's committee members listening, and they can't hear you if your microphone's not on. So please make sure that's on. And I was watching one the other day, and 2 or 3 of them didn't have it on. I was getting frustrated. So we got to make sure that everybody can hear us. You know, unless you're trying to keep something secret or something, I don't know. But I would suggest you speak into the microphone. Does anybody on the committee have a special guest? I think Representative Heverin does.
Yes, today with me I have Ann Hadley Young. She's 8 years old, and she is shadowing me for the day. So Please make Ann Hadley feel welcome to the committee today.
Great to see you, Ann. First on the agenda, and only thing on the agenda, will be House Bill 475. Chairman Meredith will be the sponsor. Please come forth, state your name, and your guests can state their name, and then the floor is yours. Got Louisville in the house. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Representative Michael Meredith representing the 19th House District, and I will let my guests introduce themselves.
J.D. Cheney, Executive Director, CEO of the League of Cities.
Shelby Somerville, I'm the VP of Government Affairs and Communications for Greater Louisville, Inc.
I'm Andy Johnson. I'm the Chief Policy Officer for Commerce Lexington.
Jim Henderson, Executive Director at the Kentucky Association of Counties.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you all for letting us have House Bill 475 in front of you today. For anybody who has been on this committee for more than the last couple of years, this is not an unfamiliar bill by the actual content of the bill or the number that you see on the bill in front of you. This was a bill that came through this committee in 2020 and was voted on the House floor as well. And it is a constitutional amendment that would remove the prohibitions in Section 181 of the Constitution that limit our local governments on the types, not the amounts, but the types of taxes that can be charged by cities, counties, urban county governments, consolidated local governments, and all of our other municipal corporations in Kentucky. Obviously, one of the issues that we have talked about significantly over the years is comprehensive tax reform. And comprehensive tax reform means different things to different people. But there's no way to truly do comprehensive tax reform if we don't address the local side as we address the state side. And without a change to the Section 181 provisions in our Constitution that was passed in 1891, we don't have the ability to do any kind of comprehensive tax reform at the local level. Kentucky is only one of 17 states across the nation that have local income taxes or occupational license fees. And we're one of the 5 most reliant states in the nation on those local income taxes to fund our city and county governments. These restrictions in the Constitution have been talked about for well over 2.5 decades. I have a report here in front of me that was an interim report from 1996 and 1997. And the first recommendation of the task force that met in 96-97 was to create more flexibility in taxing methods for local governments through constitutional amendment and statutory changes. If we want to remove the over-reliance on our occupational or income-based taxes at the local level, this is a move we must make. If we want to provide more flexibility to our local governments in setting the course for their future, this is a change we must make. The one thing that has changed in House Bill 475 from the previous time it was before this committee and before the House is there is one clarifying sentence in the bill that just ensures that if we put on some type of a sales tax in correlation with the streamlined sales tax agreement, it would have to follow the state base and be administered substantially similar to the way that the state sales tax is administered. This change would not just lock us into a sales tax, but it would open up other options. Right now, we are specifically, for our local governments, limited to occupational license fees, some fees, and property taxes for the funding of those local governments. And this would open that up so that in the future, we don't have this discussion again. If new types of taxes become the thing that are going to recruit new businesses to your state, or if new types of taxes are going to be what are needed for the flexibility in local government. I think, again, right now we think about sales taxes often because that's one of the discussion that goes on around the nation currently. But this would open up for other potential opportunities if those things change as well. And again, it doesn't change anything just because of this going on the ballot or you all passing this bill today or us passing it through the General Assembly. This would still have to be ratified by the voters. We passed House Bill 476 in the Local Government Committee yesterday that keeps the status quo and ensures that every county, city, or other local government can continue charging any of the taxes or fees that they're authorized to do in statute currently, but they couldn't expand to anything new until we actually came in as a General Assembly once this amendment is passed and ratified on the ballot by the voters, and wrote our own statutory framework for the new types of taxes we'd be looking at. At this time, I will let my guest speak a little bit about the need for this bill and their comments on it. Andy, do you want to start?
Sure. Can you all hear me okay? Is this close enough? So again, I represent Commerce Lexington, and our chamber organization represents more than 1,800 members across all sectors and all business sizes. We are also very involved in economic development efforts, not only in Lexington, but in a 9-county region that includes Fayette and the surrounding counties. And our mission within that effort is really to attract and retain jobs in Central Kentucky. We are in support of House Bill 475 because local tax policy is very important to job creation. Something that we are working on right now with local officials and business leaders and our economic development professionals in the 9-county region is what we're calling a regional competitiveness plan. We're working with a national economic development consultant. We've been working with this person since July to look at comparison cities and regions that we compete against for jobs on a regular basis, just to determine what are those areas that are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, and what are opportunities for us to improve our business climate. And from a business climate standpoint and a public policy standpoint, one of the issues that's been flagged at the top of the list is our local tax policy. It is a barrier to our competitiveness. You know, unlike economic development efforts in other cities and states, Kentucky's system is heavily reliant at the local level on income taxes on our workers, as well as the net profit taxes on businesses. For example, the city of Lexington, more than 65% of the local revenues come from payroll taxes and business net profit taxes. So if our local governments, in our opinion, if our local governments had more flexibility to consider other sources of revenue, it possibly could enable our communities to lower or even eliminate those taxes on productivity, much of what's being considered at the state level, all in the aim to improve our business climate. So we are, and just in summary, we're advocating to the General Assembly to allow the constitutional amendment to go on the ballot, to let the voters decide, and hopefully set the stage for a more robust discussion within the General Assembly about overall tax modernization and what our local tax structures could look like. In the same way that having a diverse economy is good for our cities across the Commonwealth, we believe that providing more options to diversify our tax structure along with additional flexibility and appropriate guidance in place, will make our local communities more competitive for jobs and talent in the future. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Shelby Somerville, and I'm with Greater Louisville, Inc. We represent over 1,800 businesses in the Greater Louisville region. It's a 15-county region, and our members strongly support this constitutional amendment as well, and thank Representative Meredith for his continued leadership on this issue. As has already been stated, Kentucky's Constitution is very overly restrictive with the types of taxes that cities and counties have the right to levy, and because of this, our local tax system hasn't changed since the Constitution was put in place. So as Rep. Meredith has said, our state is in the minority when it comes to how dependent we are on occupational taxes for local government revenue. Louisville is almost 60% of Louisville Metro's revenue comes from occupational taxes, so it's pretty much a one-legged stool right now, and they need more options. And this outdated tax structure keeps Kentucky cities and counties at a competitive disadvantage with our peer cities because their hands are tied when it comes to new streams of revenue. We need to build a more competitive local tax structure to support economic growth, promote business development, and attract and retain top talent. Taking this first step and passing the constitutional amendment will give you all, the General Assembly, the opportunity to rethink and recreate the way that local tax structures work in the Commonwealth. So we urge the General Assembly to pass this constitutional amendment and let the voters decide on this. We think it's been far too long, and this will make Kentucky more competitive, and we're very supportive of this issue. Thank you for your time today.
JD will be cleanup, right? So, I think as you think about the word tax reform, those words tax reform, as Chairman Meredith said, I think about when you go to see a counselor and they put this ink blob on the wall and they ask you, what do you see? That people see different things sometimes. Sometimes you see a butterfly, sometimes you see a flower, whatever. And I think that it is an evolving idea with a lot of folks when you start talking about tax reform in Kentucky. I think when you start talking about the conversation that happens after a constitutional amendment, it's one of those things that you can't even really begin to think about it much until we get past this point. So I think there's a lot of conversation yet as people begin to ask, what does that look like at the local level on the backside of a constitutional amendment? But until, as Chairman Meredith said, unless and until this advances, a lot of those conversations are academic. They really are. And I think that, I know Chairman Bratcher's been to Simpson County, and, we're a border county. I think we see the importance of competing with states like Tennessee, who have a less dependency on a income tax, more on a consumption tax. Ohio County border counties may see something totally different. Counties on the far east and west may see a different kind of competitive edge. And I think about the National Association of Counties motto, that when you've seen one county, you've seen one county. There really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to this. What we support, I think, at the county level, and I think JD would say the same at the city level, is that we trust local decision makers to figure out at the local level, what kind of tax policy works best for their county. And I think most counties are very interested in economic development. We were in Simpson County. And as a result of that, the kind of focus we put on what taxes should look like, we're very much reflective of that. I think about my friend Judge Buchanan. I know Chairman Meredith represents Warren County. 25 years ago, when I was first elected judge, he started talking about the need for a county sales tax. That would be a huge boom to Warren County. And it could very well cause a decision maker like Judge Buchanan to have no reliance on an income tax. You move over to Allen County, which is primarily a community where people are moving to live, not as much job creation there. The kind of need for taxes in that county may be slightly different. I do want to make sure that the legislature knows that among our membership, the vast majority support tax policy that moves towards more consumption-based taxes. I think that's a general trend across the state. But again, one size doesn't fit all. A lot of that conversation is academic at this point, unless and until we have this constitutional amendment passed. We're really talking about the what ifs and kind of dreaming about that. 38 other states have a local sales tax option where a county or a city or a combination of both can pass a countywide sales tax, a city-only sales tax, whatever that looks like. So it's clear that that works in a lot of other states, that local decision makers have been trusted with that decision. But in some of those states, they have occupational taxes or income taxes. Some of them they don't. Florida has a local gas tax. I know that's a tough vote to take sometimes. If we could pass a tax at the local level to put on gas to fund the roads and bridges in our county, some counties might make that decision. Indiana has a food and beverage tax. I don't even know how that works. But every other state has some myriad of local taxation options. And as Chairman Meredith said, unless and until this constitutional amendment advances, we're really cornered into those that we now have, and we can't really talk about that. So it's for that reason that counties support the idea to move this conversation forward so we can talk about what that looks like at the county level. And so, JD, if you want to wrap up with the city.
And Jim mentioned my judge, Judge Mike Buchanan, down in Warren County. And I think when they did the study 25 years ago, Judge Buchanan's estimations of if he could put a 1% sales tax on in Warren County, it would have exceeded his current receipts from both his property tax and his occupational tax by over $1 million at that time. And that was 25 years ago.
Chairman Bratcher and members of the committee, I certainly thank Chairman Meredith for carrying this legislation and being a champion. It's great to sit here both with their county counterparts and the business community from Lexington and Louisville and the businesses that they represent. We've been singing this song for an awful long time, as Chairman Meredith pointed out. We've talked about this for several years about needing to modernize. In fact, the legislature has talked to us about what are you going to do to change? What are you going to do to make it better? And there's a few key points here in cleaning up, not cleaning up, because they've said what needs to be said already. One, the language before you in the amendment to 181. You need to understand legally what 181 does. It's not a restriction directly on local governments. It's a restriction on you all, the General Assembly. That constitutional provision says that you all can't legislate outside of those three types of taxes that Representative Meredith just mentioned. And so what the bill does is essentially, and literally, not essentially, takes the handcuffs off the policy-making body in this Commonwealth to design legislation that would allow local governments to do more competitive tax code. You all are in the process of having vigorous discussions right now about the way the state tax code looks, and you're really hands off with regard to the local because your power has been restricted by the way 181's written. And so if you look at that language, all it says at this point is that the General Assembly will have the power to be able to authorize local governments to impose any type of tax not inconsistent with that's not inconsistent with the Constitution. It frees you all to have the policy debate. And of course, there's all kinds of stakeholders that'll be involved in that: city governments, county governments, special purpose governmental entities, the business community, residents and citizens, in a collaborative effort to make the best tax code for local governments. My counterpart, Director Henderson from CAECO, said it very well. And you all know, just sitting in this committee, that one of the biggest advantages in this state is the fact that we have such diversity in our communities. We know that Wickliffe is very, very different on the Mississippi River down in western Kentucky, very, very different than Elkhorn City, Representative Blanton, down in the eastern part of the state. It is a great advantage for this Commonwealth to have such diversified communities. But because they're so diversified, their tax bases are very different. Louisville may be able to leverage one type of tax based on their unique capabilities compared to Berea, for example. Some may rely more on insurance premium taxes and some on occupational taxes. But creating a flexible code so that communities and local governments can leverage their unique assets is a way to do this, because the Commonwealth's not going to progress. You've heard me say this before. The whole is only as great as the sum of its parts. And we've got to invest in those local leaders and local business leaders and local residents to decide how to do this. So all we're asking with this constitutional amendment is for you all to free yourselves to preside over the policy dialogue about what the local tax code looks like. This will not create a wild west of local government taxation. I want to point to, I want to be very clear that this, with 476 that Chairman Meredith passed out of his committee yesterday, if the voters approve this, the status quo remains the same. It doesn't harm anybody, but we're not going to be able to go out and say, well, let's go put that gas tax on to fund our local roads, which we need, by the way. But it's not going to happen without statutory authorization from the General Assembly. So it preserves the rights of the General Assembly to do that. And this just isn't, the last point I'll make, it's not just happenstance that we're here doing this bill. Chairman Meredith, along with several other members of the General Assembly, outside consultant groups, spent a long time over the past 3 or 4 years, really, of studying, bringing in other consultants to look at us compared to other states. And the recommendation and why this legislation was first introduced in 2020 was as a result of those studies, looking at how we compare to other states. And you couldn't reach any other conclusion when you looked at the data that Kentucky is behind because our legislative body, our state legislature, is restricted in the power that it has with regard to designing the state tax code. So we're asking you to invest in yourselves with the capability to make these decisions. Appreciate it.
And JD mentioned this is not happenstance. I have with me this large binder that you find me with quite often. That's the product of 3 years of research about every city and county government in Kentucky and peers across our nation, from both internal documentation from our Department of Local Government, from KLC, from KACO, and outside groups that we worked with in crafting this legislation. I'm also proud that the bill's bipartisan. We have 36 Republican co-sponsors on this bill and 5 Democratic co-sponsors on this bill, as you see it before you right now. And I want to finish, we had another presenter who I hoped could be here, but he had a conflict and wasn't able to. We presented this bill in the interim in the Local Government Committee. And one of the presenters that was there that day, and we wanted to be here with us today, is a gentleman named Carter Hendricks from Hopkinsville. Carter's a former professor at Southwestern Kentucky, or Hopkinsville Community College. He's the former CEO of the Chamber in Hopkinsville. He's the former mayor of Hopkinsville, and he's now an economic developer in Hopkinsville. And just to give you a very, very stark situation, kind of the tale of two cities, I would say. In 1970, Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and Clarksville, Tennessee were essentially the same size, with about 25,000 people living in both those communities. Today, Hopkinsville's population is about 32,000. The population of Clarksville is now 160,000 people. If Clarksville were in Kentucky, it would be our third largest city behind Louisville and Lexington. Over that time period from 1980 to 2020, Tennessee has grown by 47%. Nearly 7 million people living in the state of Tennessee now. Kentucky's grown by about 20% and is roughly at 4.5 million, just a little over half the size of Tennessee. A lot of this is because of economic development. A lot of it is because of good tax policy. And this is not just about recruiting businesses. We all know that we have a workforce problem in Kentucky that we have to address. And this is about recruiting people to come here to take good paying jobs. And we have this photo that will be a little hard to see, but the state line is right here, kind of in the middle. And above that state line, you see Christian County and Hopkinsville, and there's very little development in that area. But over that last 40-year period, you look and you see the boom in development below that state line. And the thing that's common with everyone on this is that military base straddles the state line between Christian County and Clarksville, Tennessee. But people have consistently chosen to live in Tennessee due to the tax code and the advantages that they see there. And I wish Carter could have been here to share that story himself. It's a very compelling story when you see all the things that he's worked in over the years. But again, I'm glad to have bipartisan support of this bill through co-sponsorships. I'm glad to have chambers who are supporting this bill around the state. I'm glad to have KCO and KLC supporting this bill, and I'm glad to have economic developers supporting the bill as well, because they see that this is a transition to the future for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. That's all the remarks I have.
I got a motion on the bill by Representative Blanton and a second by Representative Derek Lewis. Now, we have 4 people who want to speak, but we have another speaker. So do we want to, Miller, Weber, Blanton, Nemus, do you want to speak to the table now, or do you want to wait till the presentation is over? It's up to you. Miller. Okay, go ahead. Representative Miller.
And I'll preface this for everybody on camera. I am a co-sponsor of this bill. However, I'm not going to be around after December 31, so when this will happen, I'm trying to speak for my constituents, my Jefferson County constituents particularly, because there is very, very little trust in Louisville Metro government right now. And so I'm going to speak as if I was one of my constituents. Why won't this be the Wild Wild West, JD? Jim, what will make it not in addition to tax instead of an in place of or an instead of tax? Convince me as a voter who's going to be voting in November.
So first, Chairman Miller, I really appreciate that question, because it seems to be the most common question. If we pass this, a lot of people say, if we pass this constitutional amendment, city and county governments are going to go absolutely crazy and enact all types of taxes. And let me just be very, very clear. Absolutely not. That cannot occur with this language, and that's why looking at the language is important. We spend a lot of time, KCO and KLC up here, advocating for home rule, trust local decision making. We want home rule in taxation. We want flexibility with taxation. This bill, this constitutional amendment, does not grant home rule to local governments when it comes to taxation. All this bill does is say that the General Assembly can, by general law, requiring a statute, so a subsequent act of the General Assembly, authorize local governments to do any number of taxes that wouldn't violate the Kentucky Constitution. So it's not a home rule provision on taxation. Right now, the General Assembly has preeminent primacy, authority over the way local government taxes reads, and this does not modify that. So, one, all it says is a General Assembly by general law. So we require statutory authorization from this body in order to do the type of tax. Number 2, just to provide greater assurance on that, the bill you voted on yesterday in local government committee puts belt and suspenders on that issue by saying, here in the statute, we're going to repeat the fact that in order for local governments to be able to act certain types of taxes, it's going to take a general law. And that was necessary because the General Assembly had said in the past, because you only had 3 types of taxes, there were some statutes on the books right now that said cities and counties can do anything authorized by the Constitution. Well, you see, that could be a problem if you had the amendment approved, that language still on the books. Then we would have statutory authorization to be pretty liberal. But when you couple 475 and 476 together, that absolutely cannot occur from a legal perspective.
And to be clear, the language that you see in 476 is, again, substantially similar to language that was before us in 2020 when the constitutional amendment was up the last time. That was not a standalone bill at the time. It was a part of the revenue bill, but that language still existed in those efforts 2 years ago.
Representative Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a question here that I guess I'll direct this to Jim and JD. So is it a fair assessment to say, I'm now in my 10th year in the legislature, and over those 10 years, I've sensed that county and local and city governments, there's a greater expectation, there's more responsibility, that more expectation from the folks that they represent for services and for local governments to do things. And one of the things I see with the proposal before us is I meet with local officials, and many times I don't have the answer because they're coming to us for the answer. I see this as giving them some of the tools that they need to better serve their local communities. And is that a fair assessment, that local governments have had greater expectations from their constituents, from the responsibilities they have? Have we seen an increase in that over the last, say, the 10 years that I've been here?
Absolutely. And with the limits on the current types of taxes that are available at the local level, and as those expectations grow and the cost associated with them grow, they're often growing exponentially, not at the rate that the tax revenues would keep up with. And this is not unlike the plight that you all find yourselves in at times here. So yes, the short answer, and if I could answer Representative Miller too in your question, I may be still a hopeless romantic, and I tell my folks back at the office all the time, whether I like the outcome or not, I still believe that the voters always get it right. I believe in the system. And to your question about how to promise that it doesn't become something that people wouldn't want, and I've said this before to legislators, and I hope it's always received in the right way, is the same folks who vote for you all to be entrusted to make good policy. They vote for our members of Congress to make good policy. They vote for the President of the United States, and they vote for their county judge or their mayor. I mean, it's the same people who make those decisions. They vote on constitutional amendments. And so I think I still do have this implicit trust in the voters at the local level to decide who should be in those jobs. And if a county judge like I was levied taxes that they didn't like, or didn't trust the way we were spending that money, or thought we were taxing too much, they had a mechanism to take care of that. And they would have voted me out. And so again, I think that it's incumbent upon people like county judges, mayors, legislators, and others to convince the electorate that we share your views, we share your values, we share the kinds of tax policy that we think is good for our state. And for me, again, a county that was involved in economic development, I wasn't going to make policy at the local level that was going to run business out of our county. And so again, that's the assurance that I could give as a former county official. And again, that most of our county officials have that same basic viewpoint. But Representative Weber, there's no question that the demands on counties is growing, and cities, I'm sure, would answer the same way. And right now, we're just about at the cap of what our options are at the local level.
I'll just say amen. I mean, I agree with everything that Jim just said.
And Representative Weber, I would add one thing. It's not just the demand locally by the constituent base for services that probably weren't envisioned years ago when this tax structure was initially put in place. It's also the mandates that have been passed down by the General Assembly to do more things over the years, and not just mandates, because we've done, I think, a pretty good job of holding off most of the mandates over the time that I've been in the General Assembly. But services that the state has entrusted our local governments to perform have increased in cost tremendously. We think about counties specifically, it's the jail cost that has increased tremendously. And that's really a state responsibility that we've passed along to the county governments. When you think about the cities, and it applies to the counties too, but I think the biggest one is, and you know this very well, the cost of providing pensions to our public employees has skyrocketed over the years, and options have not gone up with that. And they need some balance and some flexibility to be able to take care of those things that the state has really put the burden on, not just the ask of the local constituent base.
Thank you all. I appreciate that.
Representative Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my question is probably for Director Henderson. I'm from Louisville, so this may seem odd coming from me, but here in Kentucky, we have very a lot of diversity among our counties. We have some of the richest counties and some of the poorest counties. In fact, some of the poorest counties in the entire United States. What guardrails are in place to make sure that we don't increase that gap between those counties that have considerable wealth and those counties that are really, really struggling, and again, are in the lowest economic state of the entire United States? My fear is that this could be used to much advantage of larger, more wealthy counties at the detriment of some of our smaller, less wealthy counties.
I do appreciate that question coming from a resident of the largest county in the state, and that's a legitimate concern. I mean, we still have this, we do have this growing divide that exists all throughout the country, by the way, between the rural and urban, and so that's not unique to Kentucky. Half of our counties lost population in the last census. That's real. It's a fact. I will say that, and many of the county officials in those smaller counties don't completely see the value in what this could offer them at perhaps the option to do a local sales tax. We studied that as best we can. The information is hard to get on a county-by-county basis on sales. But surprisingly, every county in the state would benefit in a pretty significant way if they had the ability to levy a county-wide 1% sales tax. And I'm just using that for an example. And so some of those smaller counties are also counties that don't have much industry or business. So they're already not overly reliant in some cases on an occupational tax. Property taxes in some of those counties, Representative Blanton represents a couple of those counties. In some of those counties, they are at the max right now on what they can even charge on property tax. So you're already seeing this huge disproportionate burden on some people in some of these counties on the property side. I mean, if you're in some of those counties that the property values are declining, then the rates are going up, property tax rates. You actually could provide some relief to those folks who are now, in some cases, hostages in their own county because they can't leave, they have property they can't sell, and that's their home, with shifting some of that burden away from property to some level of consumption. Because I think we all recognize there are folks who are in the system who aren't paying many property taxes. They're not paying a lot of income taxes or any insurance taxes. They deal in a currency that's not often taxed. And so in some parts of the world, I think a consumption tax actually taxes a whole new group of folks who are kind of off the radar. So again, I think I share that concern about the overall rural-urban divide in our state. This, I think, perhaps even helps that more than you might think by shifting some of those current taxes around. I think it could.
And I would just say, Leader Jenkins, that the other part of that, and you know my district, it straddles the third largest city in the state and one of the smallest counties in the state. My small county has never had an occupational tax. I don't know that they would put a local consumption tax on, but I think that would be more palatable to the population in our community than the occupational tax would be, considering the workforce that we have locally in our community. The other thing that I would say is, and we think about retail centers, places like Louisville, Lexington, Bowling Green, where folks come to shop, but I think you also have to think about the proliferation of what I would call the Dollar General effect today. Think about how many small communities now have a Dollar General or multiple Dollar Generals. I have 2 of them and a Family Dollar in Edmonson County today. And many of those transactions, if you had a consumption tax at the local level, would be taxable transactions that would create revenue for those communities. And that would affect many rural communities that may not even be benefiting from an occupational tax today.
You know, when you think of tourism and the Bourbon Trail, and there's so many areas that smaller counties could be creative and find ways to capture with some flexibility. Representative Blanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for presenting today. So I'm going to ask a couple questions, but in a form of a statement, and you tell me if I'm understanding this correctly. First of all, this is the first step in a process that will put it in the decision-making hands of the citizens of the Commonwealth. They're the ones going to decide, yes, we want this. And let's say that they say, yes, we do want this. There are safeguards put in place to prevent our cities and counties from just going in and randomly placing sales tax any way they want to. Would that be a correct summation?
Representative Blanton, that is a perfect summation. The
Okay.
first step would be the General Assembly passing this legislation. The second step would be the voters having an opportunity to decide yes or no. Do they want this ability? We have the guardrails on if they say yes, that nothing changes currently until we as a General Assembly come back and create a framework for the future on what these taxes would look like, that we would be able to change over time if we needed to. And then the local elected officials would still have to take a vote to decide what they want to do in their individual communities.
Very
So
good.
it's about a four-step process.
Very good. My next question, again, in the form of a statement based on your testimony, Representative Meredith, is that if, I believe you said Warren County, that if they had the ability to do this, that it would generate more than their property taxes and occupational taxes. So I come from an area that even though we have occupational taxes, we don't have a lot of occupations necessarily. They're raising insurance taxes, and that's sitting on a certain group of people as well. As pointed out by Judge Henderson, I come from an area that statutorily we are maxed on our property taxes. Maxed. Can't go any higher by statute. And we're feeling the effects of it. So I can see the potential of this lowering property taxes in some of those counties, which would be a huge benefit, and dispersing this tax over a much broader group of people, number-wise, to help carry the load. And also, I see it as a benefit of my counties are mostly, or not mostly, but have a lot of pass-through individuals that stop and they use our convenient marts. They stop and eat. They come visit. They come to one of our local colleges. So some of our taxes that we would then be able to raise for our budgets within our counties will be from people outside our counties. And it'll help take away some of the burden of the local people to spread that tax out in that manner. Would that be an accurate statement on my part?
I think that is a very astute observation.
Thank you, Mr.
You're getting a
Chairman.
gold star today, John. Representative Wheatley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and presenting this bill to us. I'll frame my questions with, I come from an area where Northern Kentucky, a lot of the local officials are for this, and I've trusted their opinions in the past, and I'll certainly weigh in with them again on this issue. But I do have some really 20,000-foot questions, and Representative Meredith, you and I have talked already, and I might reserve a few more of these detailed questions for later. But so we are looking to change. We're looking to give the opportunity for the voters to decide if they want to have a local sales tax or local taxes, more control on the local end to tax. If anybody can answer this question on this panel is, and the gentleman to the far right, of the way I'm looking, talked about a certain currency that's not been taxed yet, or is not taxed very much. So if there's going to be a change in the tax code on the local level, somebody's going to pay more and somebody's going to pay less, or is that an incorrect assumption? Somebody's going to pay more taxes, somebody's going to pay less taxes.
Can I answer the currency question? I want to make sure I was clear. Sometimes I speak in riddles unintentionally. I was trying to be coy. I was talking about cash. I mean, there's a lot of cash that floats around in lots of communities, and people who deal in cash still have to buy things. And, and right now they're kind of off the radar. That I hope that was what was obvious in my comment. I wasn't talking about like cryptocurrency or anything like that. I don't understand all that. But I just think that there are consumers, I think to Representative Blanton's point even, that are not even Kentuckians, that are traveling and doing things. And I think about Lee County, a small rural county that's got Natural Bridge and all that. I mean, the folks who come in there from Ohio and Indiana, and they're coming in there and they're spending a lot of money. Yeah. They're not paying a lot of Kentucky taxes other than a sales tax. So for the locals, that could be a big boom. So again, currency. I just want to be clear what I was talking about there.
And I would just say, Representative Wheatley, and I agree with Jim, that cash-based economy can go in different directions. It may be folks who are working directly for cash and off the records of payroll records or 1099 records, it's not being reported to the federal government for whatever reason. It could be folks take the cash directly issue out. It may be people who are very, very wealthy but are not working and paying an occupational or an income tax, but they're buying products still. They're still participating in the economy. They're just not actively engaged in working and earning an income. It may be trust. It may be savings. It may be all those kinds of things. And I'll say one further. I think we all talk about sales tax and consumption-based taxing when we think about this bill currently, because that's what's being talked about on a national level. Mm-hmm. And that's what most states are doing. And that's something that Kentucky is very different than most of our peer states with. But this is not just restricted to a sales or a consumption-based tax. This could be any kind of tax that becomes something that states across the nation are doing in the future.
Hotel taxes, other things that we don't, I know some we can do.
It could be many different things. This is just about, like I said, removing the constitutional barrier to allow the General Assembly to be able to craft things by its general statutes.
And that gets to this next question, which is guardrails that the current constitutional or Section 181 has, and I just want to be sure about this. So if this does pass, the voters pass it, and we have the ability, and even if I know 476 would give us would put any pause for anything happening right away, we then would have to pass more legislation to change or have the ability for local taxes to go into effect. But is there any other guardrails within the current Section 181 or anything else that would keep us, the state, from giving Simpson County the availability to do a sales tax and Kenton County the availability to do a certain percentage of sales tax? What keeps that Wild West from happening that JD just mentioned?
Again, I think it's done by statute, and I will. Things change over time, and this is something I want to be very clear on. And this was something we didn't know in 2020 when we presented this bill. We had a question asked during the interim this year when we made the presentation to the local government committee about the history of Section 181 of the Constitution. And I didn't know the answer to that at the time. But we had a really good LRC staff member who had worked on this issue who provided me with some of the debates from the Constitutional Convention and things that happened. The language that we consider an impediment or a barrier today was actually legislation or constitutional language that was meant to provide greater flexibility. Because prior to that Constitution passing, prior to this section being amended in the way that it was, property taxes were really the only option that anyone had. And there was some case law that happened over a period of time with regards to occupational licenses. There was I think, a small amendment to the Constitution right around the turn of the century that provided the language that you see in front of you today that, again, we consider a barrier now, but again was meant to be flexible in a way that we're trying to provide new flexibility today.
So just to supplement, the guardrails now say General Assembly can only do 1, 2, 3, ad valorem taxes, franchise fees, occupational fees. You can't consider anything else. That's why we're not part of the bigger dialogue on state tax reform, which is an important component. Guardrails, the guardrails, like you're saying, the General Assembly passing a bill that says Simpson County can do a sales tax, but Estill County can't, or others. That's read in tandem with the rest of the Constitution. You all cannot enact special or local legislation. So the General Assembly is not going to be in a position to pick winners and losers and and favorites with regard to allowing one geographic area perhaps to do that. Now, there's some technical stuff, as Leader Jenkins knows, with consolidated local governments being a different type of government than urban county governments. But in general, that other constitutional provision on special or local legislation is going to also be a barrier when you read the new 181 when the voters approve it in conjunction with those other provisions.
And 476 addresses, to the best of our knowledge and everything that we've looked at, all of those different types of local governments: consolidated locals, urban counties, cities, and municipal corporations.
All right, thank you.
Ms. Shannon? Please state your name, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Chairman Bratcher. Good morning, committee members. My name is Shannon Stiglitz, and I'm the Senior Vice President for the Kentucky Retail Federation, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs, I should say, for the Kentucky Retail Federation. And I want to thank the committee members. I don't think it's any secret where the Kentucky Retail Federation's concerns lie with the proposed constitutional amendment. I'd also like to thank Chairman Meredith for continuing to meet with us regarding our concerns. And our concerns really are focused around the sales tax potential. We see right now that the Constitution is a constitutional protection for taxpayers, and we want to keep that as it is. Sales taxes for retailers impact consumers' behavior, particularly, and again, I recognize the General Assembly will have to have its say over how it's structured. So please know that I'm not saying that this constitutional amendment automatically authorizes a sales tax to go into effect. I want to be clear on that. But there are complexities of, if you have City A has a sales tax, if the General Assembly authorizes it and City B does not, consumers shop with their feet, and so how that impacts consumer behavior and how that creates an unlevel playing field for our members. And you know, we collect today $2.3 billion in sales tax for the Commonwealth, and we employ a significant number of Kentuckians in jobs. And we want to ensure that our consumers, we know that they are price sensitive. Every 1% increase in the cost does impact their spending levels. And so we also have to understand that for small retailers in particular, the complexities of collecting a sales tax it's complex to collect the state sales tax today. And for doing that, they get a $50 per return. That's their limit on the collection. So from the constitutional amendment perspective, we see that Kentuckians today have a constitutional protection against a local sales tax, providing them with a seamless state sales tax structure. We also, again, want to make sure that our Kentuckians have affordable prices at retail locations. Those are our basic concerns. I don't think you're surprised, but we wanted to make sure that our members' voices were heard. And thank you for the opportunity.
Representative Nevis.
I'll just explain my vote, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Any other discussion?
May I make one
Yes.
reply to that? Just very briefly. And Shannon and I have continued to talk, and I appreciate the dialogue very much. I understand their concerns very well. But if you talk about an unlevel playing field, we have communities that have occupational taxes. We have communities that don't have occupational taxes. That already creates an unlevel playing field with regard to job creation and attraction. We have communities that have insurance premium taxes. We have communities that don't have insurance premium taxes. That's already an unlevel playing field created by the tax codes that we already have. And finally, again, I mentioned the one change from last year's legislation to this year's legislation, and that was meant to help our retail and business groups to come to the table a little more on this, because we wanted to ensure in the Constitution JD, Jim, and I have committed the entire time that we've gone through this process. We know how important the streamlined sales tax agreement is to Kentucky and the money that it brings in, the additional funds that it brings in that we wouldn't be eligible for otherwise. And we didn't want to read streamlined into the actual Constitution because what if we get out of streamlined someday? And so we didn't want to refer to it directly, but we wanted to be very clear in our intent to follow that agreement, and that's why we have that new sentence in the legislation that you see before you today that says whatever we do will follow the base that the state sets to create clarity, and it will be administered substantially the same. What that means is those returns will not be filed individually with every unit of local government across the state that has one of these. Those returns will be filed to the Department of Revenue in Frankfurt, and then those funds will be dispersed back out in accordance with the streamlined sales tax agreement.
Do you have a question? Oh, okay. Bill has been moved and seconded. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Representative Blanton,
Aye.
Representative Cantrell,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to cast and explain a yes vote. I'm voting yes, number one, because I told you I was going to vote yes, and some of the proponents of this bill, and I want to keep my word to that. The second reason is obviously there are some safeguards in place. This is ultimately going to go to the voters, who are the ultimate arbiters of everything we do here, including our ability to even be here. And but I wouldn't misunderstand my yes vote today as a yes vote on the floor. There's still a lot of conversation that needs to take place, but I want that conversation to take place in a larger on the larger House floor. So thank you.
Representative Fisher, Representative Gooch,
Yes.
thank you. Representative Heverin,
Yes.
Representative Imes,
Yes.
Representative Jenkins, Representative Cook,
Yes.
Representative Derek Lewis,
Yes.
Representative Scott Lewis,
Yes.
Representative Miller, Representative Moser,
Yes.
Representative Nemes.
May I briefly explain my yes vote, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman? Thank you. I share a lot of the concerns that the Retail Federation has had this morning. I don't want an add-on. I don't want a bunch of add-on additional new taxes. I appreciate the guardrails, Mr. Chairman, that you brought to this bill. You and I have talked about it a great deal, and I appreciate that. I'm voting for it for two reasons. One, because working families who are property owners are soaked in our communities, and they need more options. Our cities and counties need more options for taxes rather than to continue to go to the working family who owns property. The other reason is, and we've not talked about this much, we've talked about, does this person pay more? We need growth. Our tax policy in Kentucky needs to be toward growth. We are a poor state. We have poor counties and poor cities. We can't pay for our roads. We can't pay for our schools the way we want to. We can't pay for the health care the way we want to unless we have growth. And in my home community of Jefferson County, we've had 40,000 new people in the last 10 years. And that is unacceptable. We need growth processes. So I'm for the bill for those two reasons. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Representative Scott,
Pass.
thank you. Representative Weber,
Yes.
Representative Wheatley,
I'm briefly explain pass vote. I am favorable to this. I think I have some questions, and I'll get with the sponsor. Thank you.
Representative Bratcher,
Yes. House Bill 475 passes with favorable expression.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Thank you. Do I hear a motion to adjourn? So moved.